And so, yeah, there's a lot of talks that the Lord and I had about like, why would you have done this? Like so many whys that, now we can see a little bit more of a vantage
Still don't
point.
understand all the whys, but
I don't have all the answers, but I can see it at a higher vantage point now. But to go back in, which was risky, I never would have thought that. Like I never would have thought that brokenness would have created him leaving the marriage in a different way. So it was a lot of wrestle. It was a lot of wrestle with God. And I kept coming back to like, how do you want me? And he never released me. We're here. He never released me. Not that I'm joking about the act or the behavior, but there were lots of conversations, lots of arguments.
well, and I think
Fighting.
that when you have had divorce as a part of your story
Mhm.
before, I mean, statistically the
Mhm.
numbers show it's easier the second time, right? So
Or
you're
higher, maybe not easier.
higher,
We were
higher,
already in a higher category.
already in a higher
Yeah.
category,
Yeah.
right? So it would have been really easy for me or for her. I mean, she obviously had the biblical out, but for me to say, yeah, I'm out. I'm not doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And statistically, that's what the numbers show happens.
Mm-hmm. And I knew what both felt like. I knew what it
Yeah.
felt like to be divorced if I made that choice, which I've given myself, I set very clear boundaries from that day. If there was any, like if I found out about anything else, he's lucky I found out all at one time because that is still a boundary to this day. If there is any unfaithfulness, we're done like that, and so it's just not, it's just a bottom line boundary that I have. And I do feel very confident in that and, spiritually speaking as well. So,
Kevin, now at this point, there's the information is out. Now there's your recovery work in this. Like, when is it like this is something bigger than adultery? This is, something I've got to really got to wrestle with and get in recovery for.
Yeah, I think that as Shauna had mentioned, it 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 was never, anything, and I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it was never something that I desired or that I wanted to go after or I was chasing after. It really was in the infidelity, it was a lack of social cueing to what was happening in relationships at work. It was a lack of theory of mind to be able to put myself in different situations and see consequences
shoes.
for in Shauna's shoes
Yeah.
and see consequences to my actions. And and I knew that that's not the person that I wanted to be. And and I know that there was the discussion previously around like, everyone with autism, struggles with sexual addiction. No, it for me, I think one of the things that I see with autism is perhaps a struggle with coping. And in coping, it can be coping from a number of things. And for me, it was the coping in the uneasiness of our relationship, in the disconnection in our relationship. It was the coping of these big feelings that I didn't know what they were or how to handle them or what to do with them. Um, we might be off at home, we're not connecting, and I could go to work and have a connection or have that that
I think attention, even sometimes
attention
too,
that
accolade or
yeah, attention, the attaboy, and and again, not being able to see past the headlights down the road of where this can take you. Um, Trip, fall, and three steps later, it's like, wait, what just happened? And that can't be. And so it would start the whole cycle again of running from that, getting away, and then find myself right back into the same coping and unhealthy coping in that.
You
I
went right into recovery pretty quick into 12 step
I
at the
knew.
time.
I mean, I knew. I didn't. I think my struggle was I didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what help there was. I didn't know any of that. And so I just kept holding on and doing what Kevin knew to do, and it didn't work over and
Even though it
over.
was destructive and you
Even though it
knew
was,
that, but it was like it was such an addictive cycle trying to break that. But it was also you didn't reach out, even though you didn't know in your logic, but you also didn't reach out and say, oh wow, I might be able to reach out to my pastor, or I might be able to reach out. But it
yeah,
would just like it was like doing it yourself. Like it
yeah.
was just such a self, obviously we know the nature of addiction now, but so I feel like that
Mhm.
kind of drove you. So by the time I found out, he was like, whether, you can go, like, I understand if you need to leave this marriage, like, this is unacceptable. Um, and I'm going to go find healing. Like, I can't be living this way.
Yeah,
So he knew the nature of, the sin in it, truly. I mean, the
yeah,
destruction and the breaking of the covenant and,
yeah.
so.
And I mean, I knew that, um, we hear self-destructive behaviors and all of that, while this wasn't alcohol or drug use or whatever, it was equally self-destructive in its own way. And I knew that, and I needed to figure that out. And then more importantly, I think, because that's the difference between sobriety and recovery. So the sobriety comes first. That's when, we kind of stop the behavior, and we're not engaged in the behavior. And a lot of people can find sobriety, for periods of time. It truly comes to recovery when it becomes a lifelong pattern, that's where the rubber starts to meet the road. And I knew for me, in my life and in our relationship, sobriety wasn't going to cut it. There had to be some strong recovery work happening, and that's where I began the journey to dig in and dive underneath, not the behavior, not the infidelity, not the actions, but how did I get there? How like what was the roadmap that got me there? And not in a way that it would excuse it or justify it, because I take full responsibility for my actions, but more for me to have that awareness and that understanding of, oh my gosh, I see how that led to the, and then, and then there it goes. And I can see that. Um, for me, that was the cognitive awareness that I needed to see the change that I could bring.
Mhm.
Thank you for talking about that, because while in your situation it specifically was a sex addiction, I did say I'd put a disclaimer out there. The
Yeah.
reason we're even talking about this is Dr. Jake and Shawna were requested guests because so many people wrote in and said, will you talk about sex and or porn addiction and autism and just the extra challenges that creates in the marriage? But to your point, Kevin, if you have um, feelings or shame or self-worth issues that are unresolved, it could manifest in many types of addictive behaviors. In your case, it was sex. For some, it's porn. Some, it's work, which is a little more socially acceptable. It could be overeating, carbs, sugar, phone games, gambling. I mean, it could manifest in a lot of different ways. And it's that something isn't okay in me,
Hmm.
and we're not connected. And so I'm going to find a place I feel good about myself. And Dr. Jake made the point, I think it becomes addiction. Like when I try to stop and this isn't even good for me, but I can't seem to stop on my own, it crossed over that line.
Yes.
So you said, I just don't want to be sober, because like people who live with dry drunks is not a pleasant situation. So the person's sober and they're getting their chip, but they're not
Yeah,
really living in the recovery and the deliverance of that
absolutely.
situation.
I
Yeah.
couldn't agree more. And I think it was kind of that dry drunk feeling that led
Mhm.
us to keep pushing, like
Mhm.
kind of that determination you were asking about,
Yeah.
Dan, like I worked too hard to be the dry drunk. And
Mhm.
yet that's in a way what I felt like I was being to Shawna at times in the emotional connection in our relationship. And it
Mhm.
continued to push me driving deeper and deeper and deeper to get to the root of the emotional struggles
Yeah.
that I have, being able to connect with my wife at the level that I want, being able to finish a sentence
Mhm.
for her without interrupting her. But to have that connection that we desperately desired. And like I said, we were on a good road of recovery in that from the infidelity. And it was like,
There was a lot of trust built
but we're
in
still
years.
missing something.
Mhm.
And there were times that um, I would still have an autistic meltdown,
Which we didn't know.
which
It
we
was,
didn't know
I mean,
what
for
it
him,
was.
when we say that, I think just to define
Yeah.
that is, the escalation of, I'm asking him a question or he gets overwhelmed and it didn't come out in coping outside the marriage, which we're grateful for. But the explosive kind of response and aggression is some of the things that,
Hmm.
or like I said, like that blaming or shifting or that sort of thing to not take the weight of responsibility,
Defensiveness,
defensiveness. Yeah.
criticalness.
Hmm. So those things, when we say dry drunk or we say even autistic melt, like I don't want it to just be this overarching thought or
Term.
term
Hmm.
as we kind of define some of the characteristics. But yeah, I'm glad you said that, Stephanie, too, about doesn't matter what it is, because it also separates whatever we're using to go cope, even though his was sex and it was unfaithfulness. And yes, there's very clear lines biblically. There's some that aren't clear lines, but then we look at like, but you're still kind of leaving the relationship instead of connecting to your person, instead of connecting to your spouse.
Good.
And so we see it very similarly, even though this is our story. There's a lot of stories that we hear that are, different types, and they're kind of more fine line type coping things. So I just want to say that because I think that neglect and emotional avoidance or abandonment kind of thing, I hear it a lot from wives, even if it's like you said, like it's a gaming thing or it's, something that's still removing them
I,
from, intentionality in the relationship towards one another. It's pulling
I'm
someone away.
I'm certainly not the therapist, so I'm not going to try to be in all of that. But several autistic guys that I've talked to and things like that, we've talked about. Um, some may be alcoholics, some may be gambling, some may be other things, and um, I think what Kevin has kind of perceived in this is that one of the struggles as being autistic is coping. Um, I have very high coping and masking scores because I'm trying to cope and mask with, the effects of having autism. And I think that there are healthy ways to cope and there are unhealthy ways to cope. Um, Previously, I had very poor, unhealthy ways to cope. Now I've learned things with bilateral stimulation, with putty, with stim toys, with taking a break, with
Earplugs.
ear loops, using loops when I'm in sensory loud environments. Like there are healthy ways to cope with my autism that keeps me from going to those unhealthy places, to just calm and cope my body.
Mhm. And keep in mind, like, I guess just for the listeners too, we are in the world where we're hearing a lot of stories because our story has addiction and autism, um, that, or compulsive behavior and autism. That's why we're kind of touching on it more, kind of back to your
Yeah.
point of not everybody, but what are we doing if we can't regulate self easier? And, that's harder for him. So
Yeah.
there's different things that, okay, well, instead of getting up and going and playing a game and disconnecting on Easter Sunday, he stayed in the kitchen and picked up the plates from everyone as everybody was still talking at the table. And I know now, I didn't know for decades, oh, that's helping him. Hey,
Mhm.
great, the dishes will be done.
Yeah.
But he's picking up the plates, and some, guests might be looking like, what is he doing? That's a little different. Like, we're still sitting here talking. Some people are still eating. But for him, that was stimulating enough to help him regulate, if that makes
Well,
sense.
yeah, I
So,
was overstimulated at the table. I was
correct.
done. I needed my break, so I didn't want to leave the room completely. So I'll
Or
start
check
doing some
out,
dishes or something.
Yeah,
And
or just check out on the couch or other
yeah,
things that I think learning how to stay in the room, but water's running on his hands and he's got a task but he can still hear what we're saying. It's just, so I guess that's what we're referring to when we say kind of healthier
I don't
strategies now.
think too for us. I mean, you've written a book, which we'll talk about in a minute, but being open about your diagnosis and the neurodiversity, I think helps because then you can be like, that's
Yes.
just Kevin, that's just Dan. Dan's out
mhm.
cleaning the grill right now. It doesn't really need to be cleaned, but
Mhm.
that's he needs a
Yeah,
break
yeah, it does.
away.
Yeah, it does.
Like,
Suddenly, at the moment, it needs this.
yeah.
Um, so for those who kind of who still have the shame and keep it,
Mhm.
between themselves and they don't tell their friends and don't tell their family, I kind of think you're doing a disservice because then if Kevin's picking up plates and everybody kind of knows, then everybody knows that's
Yep.
Kevin. This is Kevin's way of staying connected to
Yep.
the situation in a way that is helpful to him. And now I don't have to feel like you're rushing me to eat. It's like, well, Kevin's done and Kevin needs task,
Exactly.
Yep,
That's exactly
yep.
right. I think one of our kids even looked at me and went, like, what? What's happening right now? And I was like, oh, that's helping dad. Like, we'll keep talking. Like, I mean, it was just that quick of it was one of our adult kiddos. And it was just like a quick redirect, but everybody knows, to your point. And we
Well,
welcomed the unmasking. So, anyways.
yeah, and I mean, I can think back to other dinners where I would go sit on the couch to try
Mhm.
and get my space. The company would leave, right? And I'd be like, "Oh, that was so great to see Dan and Stephanie tonight, wasn't that?" And she's like, "Yeah, but why'd you go to the couch? Like you just left. You got up and left and went to the couch." And I'm like, I don't know. Like,
I'm like, you didn't
As
say
I
anything.
was finished.
Exactly. He's
yeah.
like, I'm like, you didn't talk to anyone. How was that great? Like, what are you talking about? Whereas the openness is important.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to mention, and before we started recording, I asked if you would address this, and I'm going to kind of loop this in together, whether it's pornography, masturbation, sex addiction, paraphilias, pet fetishes, and so some people on the spectrum can struggle with the use of objects or clothing.
Mhm. Yep.
As part of a sex
Sure.
addiction. So whatever that is that has caused betrayal trauma for the wife, especially in this space, Kevin, sometimes some of the men I'm working with get really frustrated and kind of like fed up with their wife. Like, you know what? Okay, I did this thing. I told you that I did that with the clothing. I told you about the porn. I told you about the affair. Like, when am I out of penance? When are you going to stop asking me about this? When are we going to be done with counseling or recovery work? Like, stop asking to check my phone. I'm done. What do you say to that kind of attitude?
Well, I think the question of, when does that stop? I think the simple answer is never. It doesn't. And to be honest, I'm okay with that. Um, there was trauma created in our relationship from what I did. And I think one of the things that the betrayers often might hesitate to call what they did trauma, because that's a big word. And if I don't have to use trauma, then I can minimize my actions, I can minimize the impact, I can minimize the effects. The reality is it's trauma. Not only was my acting out trauma, but many of the verbal and emotional spouts that I had as a result of my autism have created trauma as well. And there is trauma there. And the brain, I'll leave that to Wilder to figure out, and everybody else. It's crazy. And there are times that you might be with your spouse and you go past a restaurant that triggers a memory. You might pull a shirt out of the closet to put on that triggers a memory. You might any of those types of things can trigger a memory that creates that immediate, almost like fight or flight response of that, am I safe right now?
Mhm.
And that is instinctual. It is
For the one affected.
for the betrayed.
Mhm.
And that is instinctual. It is a part of our human nature, of who we are. And I think what I would say to those that have caused betrayal is that is our obligation and our responsibility to be present in those moments
Mhm.
when those trauma triggers get hit. And they can be small or they can be big. They can come in the middle of the day or the middle of the night. That's why it's trauma. There's no way to say, you know, this is when and how it's going to happen. And you have to be prepared for that. You have to be open to that. And I see that as an unfortunate consequence for both of us.
Mhm.
It's unfortunate that she's having to deal with that too.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't want her having to ask me those questions all the time, but I also don't want her having to have that question all the time. And so if you can get out of yourself and get out of our autistic,
Well, just,
self-focus and reach for that, theory of mind and empathy to put myself in her shoes, um, I'm able to be there a little more present with her. And I, I don't, I don't, I don't really know that it'll ever go away. I really don't.
And I would say, here's what I want to say though. I think it lessens the more he's willing to do that. So like for me, we still have an open phone policy. We're almost 15 years out. He travels a lot for
Computer.
work. I don't worry about that. I could, but I don't, because I know what boundaries he's put in place. And I know that he's always open to these discussions. So if I can say, hey, can I see your phone? I just don't feel, I could say that 15 years later and he'd hand me his phone. So that part was such an intentional piece that usually, as someone that's been betrayed, I'll say, we don't want it forever. Once the kind of threat response comes down and we feel safer, um, then we don't really need it as much because we know that there's like you're willing to do it. And so
Mm.
and I think it tends to fade over time, but that just, it's a lot at first, and it takes years. It takes years, not just
Right.
a year, not months, or not, put that away. I mean, there's things that are always, and this can be for financial betrayals, like someone, has used funds. Okay, well, we're going to have to, maybe for the rest of our lives, we're going to do a monthly check-in and we're going to open everything up totally wide that we didn't do before because we now have different circumstances and different impacts on the relationship. Like Kevin said,
Yeah.
it is kind of a consequence. It's kind of a consequence for the us, for the
For both.
relationship.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
And I know it's in the book, but even prior to my diagnosis, it's I think what's the chapter, that one Friday in October or something like that. I had a full autistic meltdown, and
yeah.
Shawna was kind of left with like, what is going on? Like this is
When you say
so.
that, he left the house
Yes.
abruptly
Yes.
in a moderate, I would say a 4 out of 10 fight or a 5 out of 10, and left and said, I'm going to rent an Airbnb for 30 days. That was the catalyst that kicked off, there's something more going on. So I say
And
that, just
and
not just, defining what it means. I
yeah,
say
and
that.
so then
He
out
left.
of that, Shauna was like, I think we need to have a disclosure and a polygraph. Like, I need that reassurance and safety that this isn't a flashback and we're not back 15 years ago. And I very easily could have fought that or been angry with that, or are you kidding me? Why do we need to do this 15 years later? Do you not trust me? Whatever. Um, and I remember getting on the plane and Shauna said, well, thank you for going. And I said, no, it's an honor for me to go, to honor you with that for
With
what you
truthfulness,
need.
when we
With
say that, like
Yeah.
a polygraph can be a very big word if listeners don't know that, but it's to verify the truth. And that's something we knew. We knew that, at any point he was willing to do to verify that for me. It's not 100%, but
Mhm.
it's in the high 90s. And I knew that's something that even his yes and not fighting me, the resistance, I think causes more impact and harm. It's that, no, I'm not, you can't ask for that again. I think that was a huge piece of my healing too, as well in the first. I mean, but it took years, and I still had moments where I'd say, what about this? Or, the untruthfulness, or yeah, the lies and things still continued,
Yeah.
About smaller things, not about the big things, but still that he needed to learn to say, I need to be real intentional in everything I say, because there had been a pattern of lying. So even just lying is a breach of trust. So I don't want to say just, right? It's a big deal. So
Hey.
it's exactly, it is a.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, looking to wrap up, what if you were to package something in a somebody struggling, there's somebody listening is struggling in one of the forms that we talked about, one of the ways it's expressed, but it might be just that deep root that's down inside, nobody's surfaced yet. What do you say? What is that hope? What is that next step? What do you suggest does it go from here?
Mm.
I'd say, do you want me to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
I think what I would say to the guy for sure is you are not alone. I think the number one lie from the enemy is that you're the only guy struggling with this. Shame on you. Keep it to yourself. Don't tell anyone. And that is the vicious cycle swirl. So I would say, find someone you trust and reach out, even if it's anonymously from somebody that you find online through. Shawna probably name off the organizations in that, but find somewhere that you can reach out and begin to find that freedom of transparency in authenticity in who you are. And then the second would be community. Once you open that up and you can be transparent and authentic, like, hey, this is now me, begin to find those other guys that you can connect with that helps, I don't want to say normalize the behavior, but it helps to not make you feel so alone and isolated, reducing the shame and building a support system. But
yeah, I think there, whether we're talking about, I mean, we kind of have, multiple facets of our story, but on the addictive side, I couldn't agree more. And for the partner to hold, and I say partner, maybe we're talking wife here, if we're talking husband, but like to hold those boundaries of what's acceptable, you know, in God's sight, but in your relationship, even if you're getting pushback. So what are those boundaries? Because that truthfulness, it's the deception that usually is the greatest harm. It's not often the behavior. Yes, the behavior is painful, and we have to work through that, especially when it's something a little more personal, or sometimes a lot more personal with porn or sex addiction. That can feel very personal. But I would say, really recognizing what that is, if it's the addictive side, and if it's the unmasking or coming to, gosh, I think autism is, or Asperger traits are, a part of our story. Find a group, join one of your, have them join one of your groups. Like, that's been so helpful to us. Yeah. As we're in one right now, like, just to be with others, even if our stories aren't exactly alike, they won't be, but find others you can find parts and pieces that you can relate to. Because I think we felt so isolated, well, originally, in the addiction side of it, and the compulsive behavior side, but then, like, why is this so difficult for us? And now to go, oh, like I said, I welcome the unmasking, and we can be with others that understand and get it, and we can figure out the hard pieces and the struggles that are still there. They're still there. So that's what I would say.
And today is only just kind of touching the surface of the story. So tell us about the book that is coming out soon. Tell people how to get it, the name of it, when's it coming out?
Okay, it's this month, April of 2024. So yay. It's called Determined for More. And I wrote it, but I say Kevin has just as much credit as his yes and vulnerability of letting me put in our entire story. It's really a raw account of, even the depths of what we went through, with hope and encouragement throughout the story. Even though our story can be heavy in one sitting, there's a lot of encouragement and things that we learned along the way. And looking back and going, okay, that's 25 years of our story. So Determined for More, and it'll be on Amazon and all the bookstore stuff places. So
Very exciting. Very happy for you in getting this launched. I know what it's like
you.
to
Yep.
birth
It's a book baby.
Yep.
A book baby.
Put it out there.
Here you go. It's a
Thank
birthday
y'all
present.
so much for being vulnerable, being open, being transparent, and being guest on the podcast today.
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
Now we end with our favorite part of the tagline.
Kevin said it. I've been rehearsing it the whole time.
All right.
He said, "You're not alone on your journey."
And there is hope for your future.